Tonight we are going to spend an hour in one small Roman town, on the last ordinary day it ever had. There is nothing here you need to remember. No dates to hold on to, no names you have to keep straight. If you drift off in the middle of a sentence, that is entirely the point. The story will keep going quietly without you, and it will still be here tomorrow. So settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the room go dark around you. We are going to a bay in southern Italy, about 2,000 years ago, and we are going to walk slowly through a town that most people had no particular reason to think about. It was not a capital. It was not famous. It was a working town of perhaps 12,000 people, with a harbour, a theatre, a lot of bakeries, and a mountain on the skyline that nobody was afraid of. Its name was Pompeii. The Bay of Naples curves like a cupped hand. On a still morning, the water inside it is the colour of old glass, and the light comes off it in flat sheets, and the islands sit out at the edge of the vision as low blue shapes that seem to float slightly above the horizon. The Romans loved this coast, the way people always love a warm coastline. The very rich built villas along it with terraces that stepped down to the sea, and they wrote letters to each other complaining that the place was becoming vulgar, that too many people were coming, that it was not what it used to be. Emperors kept houses here. Retired generals kept houses here. Poets came here to be unwell in comfortable weather. And the soil was extraordinary. That was the real reason for everything. The ground around the bay was dark and crumbling and rich, and it grew things at a rate that would seem greedy anywhere else. Vines climbed up the elm trees in rows. Olives ran up the lower slopes. There were cabbages that the locals swore were the best in Italy, and onions and figs and almonds. Farmers here got 2 harvests where farmers elsewhere got 1, and they knew it, and they charged accordingly. Nobody thought very hard about why the soil was so good. The mountain stood behind all of this, to the northeast of the town, about 10 kilometers away as a bird would fly it. It was a broad, green, comfortable-looking thing. Its lower flanks were covered in vineyards, all the way up in terraces, and above the vineyards there was scrub and oak woodland, and at the top there was a flattish summit with rough ground and old rock. The wine from those slopes was decent. Not the best in Italy, but decent, and it travelled well, and people knew the name. There is a wall painting that survives from a house in Pompeii showing the mountain, as the locals saw it. It is a single green cone, thickly wooded, with a god standing beside it wearing a coat of grapes. That is what it was to them. A hill you could grow things on. A shape at the end of the street. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing decades earlier, had looked at the summit and noticed that the rock up there was scorched and pitted, as though it had once been on fire. He mentioned it in passing, the way you might mention an odd stain on a ceiling. He thought perhaps the fire had gone out long ago, when the vegetation took over. He was closer to right than anyone realized. But there was no word yet for what the mountain was. The Latin language had no everyday term for a volcano that had been quiet for 800 years. There was no memory in any living family of it doing anything at all. The last time it had erupted seriously, the people living beside it had been Bronze Age villagers who left their footprints in the ash as they ran, and every one of them had been dead for the better part of 2,000 years. So the mountain was just the mountain. Vesuvius. A pleasant green backdrop to a pleasant working town. Come down off the slopes now and into the streets. Pompeii sat on an old lava spur about 30 meters above the plain, which gave it good drainage and a good view and made it awkward to attack. The river Sarno ran nearby to the sea, and there was a harbour district below the town where cargo came in and went out. The streets were paved with hard grey basalt blocks, worn into deep ruts by cart wheels over generations. The ruts are still there. You can put your finger in them. Some of them are so deep that you can see how the drivers had to steer to avoid catching an axle, and how the stones were levered up and reset when the grooves got too bad. Because the streets doubled as drains in heavy rain, there were stepping stones set across them at the junctions, raised blocks that let you cross without going ankle deep in whatever was flowing past. The gaps between the stepping stones were spaced to let cart wheels through. It is a small, practical, slightly fussy piece of civil engineering, and it tells you almost everything about how the town worked. Somebody thought about this. Somebody argued about the budget for it. There were about 30 bakeries, each with its own millstones of hard grey lava, hourglass-shaped, turned by donkeys walking in slow circles in a small yard. There were more than 100 places to buy food and drink on the street. Counters faced outwards onto the pavement with big ceramic jars set into them, and behind the counter there was usually a small painted shrine and a shelf of cups. You could stand in the road and eat hot food out of a bowl. There were bars near the theatre, bars near the baths, bars at nearly every significant junction, and the town council periodically tried to reduce the number of them and periodically failed. There were 3 public bath complexes, at least 2 theatres, an amphitheatre older than the Colosseum by well over a century, a covered market for fish, a wool exchange, a basilica for legal business, and a forum at the centre with a temple to Jupiter at one end, and the green shape of the mountain framed neatly behind it. And there was writing everywhere. This is the part that catches people off guard. The walls of Pompeii are covered in scratched graffiti, thousands of pieces of it, and almost none of it is important. Election slogans painted in red by professional signwriters, urging you to vote for a man you have never heard of because he makes good bread. Notices of gladiator shows with the date and the promise of awnings against the sun. Someone recording that they slept here. Someone recording that the food was bad. A man announcing that he was in love, another announcing that he was no longer in love, and a third writing underneath both of them that they should stop writing on the wall. There is a line scratched in a corridor that reads, roughly, "Nothing lasts forever. The sun shines, and then it goes down into the sea." Somebody wrote that as a passing thought, without any idea, and it survived because of the very thing that makes it unbearable. Let us go for a slow walk through it before anything happens. There is no hurry at all. Start at the marine gate in the early morning coming up from the harbour. The road climbs steeply here, and it is worn smooth, and there is a separate arch beside the main one for people on foot, because carts coming down a slope like this were not something you wanted to share a doorway with. The air smells of the sea behind you and of wood smoke ahead. Come up into the Forum. It is a long rectangle of open paving with colonnades down both sides, and at this hour the shadows lie right across it in bands. Statues of local worthies on horseback stand along the edges, most of them men who paid for something and wanted it remembered. There is scaffolding on the eastern side. The temple of Jupiter sits at the northern end, and behind it, filling the gap between the columns, is the mountain. Turn east and walk along the main street. The buildings on either side are 2 stories, sometimes 3, with balconies overhanging the pavement. Ground floors are shops. Their fronts are wide open, closed at night with wooden shutters that slot into grooves in the stone, and the grooves are still there, worn by the sliding of them. A bar on the corner. The counter is faced with broken marble set in mortar in irregular pieces, a cheap and rather beautiful finish, and there are round openings in the top holding storage jars. Behind it, painted on the wall, a small shrine with 2 household spirits and a snake, which is a protective creature and nothing sinister at all. Next door, a laundry. Cloth is soaked in vats and trodden by workers standing in them, and the cleaning agent is stale urine, which is collected in jars left out on the street for anyone to use, and which the Emperor Vespasian had recently decided to tax. His son objected that it was undignified money. Vespasian held a coin up to the boy's nose and asked whether it smelled. Further along, a bakery. You can hear the millstone before you see it. A slow grinding turn, and the shuffle of the donkey walking its circle, and a man calling something to somebody in the back room. Turn off the main road into a side street where it is quieter. Here the houses show you almost nothing. Roman town houses face inwards. From the street, you get a blank wall and a doorway, and if the door happens to be open, you see straight down a corridor into a bright square of garden at the far end, with a pool of rainwater in the middle of it, catching the light, and columns around it, and greenery. That view down, the corridor was designed. The whole house is arranged so that a visitor standing at the front door is looking through the building at its best angle, and can see, framed at the end, everything the owner would like them to know about him. The gardens themselves were planted with box and rose and fig and lemon, and the roots of them left cavities in the ash too, so we know what was growing in which bed. Go up onto the town wall at the eastern side, where the ground drops away. From here you can see the plain, and the vine rows going off in stripes, and the road running out to the next town, and further off the low hills. There are tombs along the roadside outside the gate, because the dead were buried beyond the walls, and the tombs were built facing the road so that travelers would read the names. That is what a Roman wanted, to be read by a stranger who was passing anyway. Behind you, the town is waking up properly now. There is a smell of bread. Somewhere a shutter goes back. 2 men are arguing about money in the street below, comfortably, as though they do it every week. Hold that for a moment. That is the town. Everything after this happens to these streets exactly as you have just walked them. We know some of them by name. Not many, and not well, but some. There was a woman called Julia Felix who owned a very large property near the amphitheater and who had clearly decided at some point that it was too large to live in comfortably. So she divided it up and advertised. A painted notice on the outside wall offered elegant baths, shops with upper rooms, and apartments to let for 5 years, from the 6th day before the Ides of August. Tenants of good character preferred. She had a garden with a long canal down the middle of it, and a dining room where the water ran past the couches. There was another woman, Eumatia, a priestess and the daughter of a brick manufacturer, who paid for a substantial building on the Forum and had her name carved across the front of it in letters the height of a child. Her statue was put up inside by the fullers, the men who cleaned and finished cloth, which suggests she was useful to the wool trade and that the wool trade knew it. There were 2 brothers, or possibly 2 former slaves who had taken the same family name, called Aulus Vettius Conviva and Aulus Vettius Restitutus. They had money that was new enough to be enjoyable. Their house had a garden with fountains and a set of wall paintings so bright and so confident that people still queue to see them. There was a baker whose name was pressed into his loaves before they went into the oven, so that when a batch came out, you knew whose it was. And there were far more people whose names we will never have. Slaves above all. 1/3 of the population, perhaps more, working the mills and the laundries and the kitchens and the fields, sleeping in rooms with no windows. In one bakery uncovered recently, the working space had barred openings and no exit to the street, and the millstones and the donkeys and the people were shut in together. That is the town. Not a monument and not a tragedy yet. A crowded, noisy, commercial, slightly smelly place where about 12,000 people were getting on with an ordinary year, and where the fashionable thing that season was to paint your dining room with scenes of the Nile. "17 years before the end, the ground moved. It was the 5th of February in the year 62, in the middle of the morning, and the shock was severe enough that it knocked buildings down across the whole district. Temples cracked. Colonnades folded. Part of the Forum came apart. Out in the countryside, a flock of 600 sheep died, which sounds like an exaggeration until you learn that carbon dioxide seeping out of volcanic ground pools in low places and is heavier than air, and that sheep graze with their heads down. The philosopher Seneca wrote about it afterwards from Rome. He was interested in why people were so frightened. He observed that people had fled the region and sworn never to return, and he pointed out gently that this was not really logical, since there was no ground anywhere that was guaranteed to hold still. He wondered whether some kind of trapped air or fire beneath the earth was responsible. Nobody connected it to the Green Mountain. They rebuilt. Of course they rebuilt. Property was worth money, and the soil was still the best in Italy, and a damaged wall is a job for a plasterer, not a reason to abandon a town. Some of the wealthy families sold up and moved on, and their houses were bought by people a rung or 2 further down, who divided them into smaller units and put shops in the front rooms. The character of some streets changed. That is what happens after a disaster. Not abandonment. Just a slow reshuffling of who owns what. 17 years later, the work was still not finished. There were scaffolds up in the forum on the last day. There was a house with a wall half replastered and the tools still on the floor. The town was mid-renovation for nearly a generation, which is the most human detail in the whole story. And there were smaller tremors after that, on and off, for years. Enough that people stopped commenting on them. When the ground shakes regularly and nothing terrible follows, the shaking becomes weather. You mention it at the bar. You move a jug back from the edge of a shelf. You get on with the day. In the final weeks, something else was happening, though it is only obvious in hindsight. Springs that had always run began to fail. Wells that had always held water went low or dry, as the rock beneath the whole area flexed and the water table shifted. Pliny the Younger, writing about it much later, mentions that in the days beforehand the tremors were frequent, and that this did not alarm anyone, because in Campania tremors were ordinary. That sentence is the whole of it, really. Because it was ordinary. Underneath, 4 or 5 kilometers down, magma had been rising into a chamber for centuries. It was thick, sticky, gas-rich stuff, the kind that does not flow out gently. It builds pressure the way a bottle of something fizzy builds pressure, and it holds that pressure until something small gives way, and then it does not release slowly. The rock above it was cracking. That was the tremors. The gas escaping through those cracks was drying the springs. The mountain had been getting ready for a very long time, and it was giving every signal it had, in a language that nobody on earth yet knew how to read. There is no blame in this. It is worth saying plainly, because it is easy to look back and feel that somebody should have known. Nobody should have known. Volcanology did not exist. The word volcano did not exist. The idea that a green hill covered in vineyards could be a sleeping thing, rather than simply a hill, was not available to them. They were not careless. They were early. So the last summer went by the way summers do. The grapes came on. The council argued about roads. Somebody painted a new election notice over an old one. And on the slopes of the mountain, in the terraced vineyards, the pickers worked their way along the rows, standing on ground that was warmer than it should have been, and thought nothing of it at all. We are not entirely sure what day it was. For centuries, the date was given as the 24th of August, in the year 79. That comes from a copy of a letter written by Pliny the Younger, and it was accepted without much argument for a very long time. Then people started noticing things that did not fit. The bodies were found wearing heavier clothing than you would expect in a Campanian August. There were braziers set up in rooms, as though the evenings had turned cool. There were pomegranates and walnuts and chestnuts and grapes that had already been pressed, with the wine sealed into jars. There were coins in circulation that seemed to have been minted later in the year than August. And then, during recent excavations in the northern part of the town, in a house that was being redecorated, somebody found a line of charcoal writing on a wall. Building sites are full of writing like this. A workman noting a delivery, or a date, or a debt. This one recorded the 16th day before the calends of November, which in our calendar is the 17th of October. Charcoal fades. It rubs off. For it to survive on an unfinished wall, the wall had to be buried fairly soon afterwards. So the balance of opinion has shifted towards autumn. Perhaps the 24th of October, exactly 2 months later than the traditional date, which would be an elegant explanation if the manuscript copyist simply got a numeral wrong. Not everyone accepts it. The argument is still going on in journals, politely and at length, the way these arguments do. Let us say it was October then. The harvest in, the weather turning, the light going amber earlier in the evening. It made no difference to anybody in the town. The morning was normal. The bakers had started before dawn, because bakers always have. The ovens were lit, and loaves were going in. In one of them, in the town next door, a batch would be carbonized in the oven and found there, still round, still scored across the top into 8 portions, 1700 years later. Shops opened. The counters were filled. Somebody was cleaning a floor. In one house, a dog was chained in the entrance hall, as dogs were, because of the mosaic on the threshold that said "Beware of the dog," which was both a warning and a boast. The forum was busy. There were scaffolds up on 2 sides of it, and workmen on them. Somewhere in the town, there was a woman getting dressed who put on a gold bracelet shaped like a coiled snake, with an inscription on the inside from the man who gave it to her. The sun came up over the mountain, which is what it did every morning because the mountain was to the east. Early in the day, there was a small explosion at the summit. Ash came down lightly on the eastern side. It would have been strange and worth mentioning, and not more than that. Then, at about 1 in the afternoon, the mountain opened. The plug of cold rock that had been sitting in the throat of the volcano was blown out, and everything beneath it that had been held under pressure for 800 years came out at once. The sound was heard for a great distance. The ground jumped, and a column of gas and pulverized rock went up off the summit, faster than anything anyone had ever seen move. It rose several kilometers in the first minute or two. It kept rising. Within a short time, it had reached the top of the weather and gone through it, and it kept going until it was somewhere around 30 kilometers high, standing above the bay like a pillar holding up the sky. At the top, where it could rise no further, it spread out sideways into a flat canopy. Pliny the Younger, who was 17 years old and about 30 kilometers away across the water, described it later as looking like an umbrella pine. A long trunk going up, and then branches spreading out at the top, because that is exactly what it looked like, and because the umbrella pine is the tree that everybody in Italy has seen every day of their lives. He said it was sometimes white and sometimes dark and blotched, depending on whether it was carrying ash or clean steam. It is one of the best descriptions in ancient literature, and volcanologists still use his family name for this type of eruption. A Plinian column. At its peak, the mountain was throwing out well over 1 million tons of material every second. And here is where the wind decided everything. Most of the year, the wind on that coast comes off the sea from the west and southwest, and it would have pushed everything falling out of that canopy inland and away, over the empty hills to the northeast. Pompeii would have had a bad week and a strange story to tell. That day, the wind was out of the northwest. It took the top of the column and carried it southeast, straight over the town, and it held it there for the rest of the day. For a while, from the streets, it was simply an astonishing thing to look at. People came out of their houses. Of course they did. You would. A white pillar the height of 30 kilometers standing over the bay is not a thing you look away from. There would have been a lot of noise, and a lot of people asking each other what it was, and nobody having an answer because there was no answer available. The nearest thing to an explanation in anyone's mind was the gods, and the gods do not come with a timetable. Then the first of it began to fall. It came down as small white stones, light and rough and full of holes. Pumice. It is rock that has been blown into froth by gas and then frozen solid in mid-air, and it is so light that it floats on water. The first pieces would have been about the size of a fingernail, pattering on the roof tiles like the beginning of hail. It did not hurt particularly. It was warm to the touch, and it bounced. It did not stop. For the next 18 hours, pumice fell on Pompeii without a break. It accumulated at roughly 15 centimeters an hour. After the first hour, there was enough on the ground to make walking awkward. After 3 hours, it was up over the ankle, and the streets had lost their shape. After 6 hours, it was above the knee, and the doors of the houses would not open outwards anymore, because the weight of it was piled against them. And it got dark. This is the part that is hardest to hold in the mind. The column was blocking the sun, not dimming it, blocking it. By the middle of the afternoon, the town was in a darkness that Pliny described as being not like a cloudy night, but like a sealed room with the lamp put out. So people lit lamps in the afternoon in October, and the lamps showed them nothing except the falling stones. Most of the town got out. It is worth saying that clearly, because the images we have from Pompeii make it feel as though everyone stayed. They did not. The great majority left in those first hours, on foot, southwards and towards the coast, with a pillow or a cushion tied over their heads against the falling rock, which was a sensible thing to do and which several sources describe. They carried what they could. Later, along the roads out, archaeologists have found people who died with keys and lamps and small amounts of money, and one man with a bag of surgical instruments. But some stayed. They stayed for the reasons people always stay. Because the roads out looked worse than the house. Because they had someone with them who could not walk far. Because they thought it would stop soon, and everything they owned was in that building, and leaving meant losing it. Because they were slaves and had not been given the choice. Because they went into a cellar or a vaulted room to wait it out, which is the correct instinct in almost every other emergency there is. And the stones kept coming and got heavier. The white pumice gave way after some hours to a grey pumice, denser, and mixed with lumps of older rock torn out of the volcano's throat. Those pieces could break a roof tile. Some of them could break a skull. Then the roofs began to go. A tiled Roman roof was not built for 3/4 of a meter of rock sitting on it. Timbers cracked in the dark, one house at a time, all across the town, and the sound of each collapse would have carried. That is what killed a good number of the people who had chosen to shelter indoors. Not fire, not gas. The ceiling. By the middle of the night, there was close to 2.5 meters of pumice lying over Pompeii, and only the upper floors of the taller buildings were still above it. Now we cross the bay. About 30 kilometers to the northwest, at the far tip of the bay, there was a naval base called Misenum, and in command of the fleet there was a man of 55 named Gaius Plinius Secundus. We call him Pliny the Elder. He was a career officer and an obsessive. He had written a natural history of the entire world in 37 volumes, gathering everything anyone had ever claimed about plants, animals, minerals, medicine, art, and the sea. Some of it excellent and some of it nonsense, all of it collected with the same enormous appetite. He had his slaves read to him at meals, and while he was being dried after bathing, so as not to waste the time. He thought sleep was largely a waste as well. That afternoon his sister came to tell him there was a strange cloud over the bay. He went up to a high place to look at it. He asked for his sandals. He called for a fast boat because he wanted to see the thing closely, which is entirely in character and is the reason he is in this story at all. Then, as he was leaving, a message reached him from a woman called Rectina, whose house was at the foot of the mountain and who could only escape by sea. She was asking for help. So the trip stopped being a scientific outing. He ordered out the warships, the big ones, and went aboard himself. His nephew, the 17-year-old, was invited along and declined, saying he had homework. That is genuinely why we have the account. The boy stayed home with a book and lived, and wrote it down 25 years later. Pliny the Elder sailed straight towards the mountain. The sea got worse as he crossed. Ash began falling on the decks, hotter and thicker the nearer they got, then pumice, then blackened stones. The water ahead of them was filling with floating rock and with debris that had come down off the slopes, and the shore was becoming shallow and unreachable. The helmsman advised turning back. Pliny said, according to his nephew, fortune favors the brave. Then he told the man to steer for Stabii, further along the coast, where a friend of his named Pompeianus had a house and had already loaded his boats and was waiting for the wind to change so he could leave. They landed. Pliny embraced his frightened friend, and then, deliberately and visibly, asked for a bath and a meal, and was either cheerful or doing a very good impression of it, because he understood that the people watching him needed to see somebody unafraid. Then he went to bed and slept, and snored loudly enough to be heard from the corridor. While he slept, the courtyard outside his room filled up. Pumice and ash came down on the house through the night at the same steady rate. It was falling on everything else, and the level in the yard rose. And after a while, the household realized that if they left him much longer, the door would be blocked, and he would not be able to get out at all. So they woke him. Everyone gathered, and talked it over by lamplight. The house was shaking. The walls seemed to be coming away from their foundations and going back again, over and over, and staying inside felt like waiting under something that was about to fall. But going outside meant standing in the open under a sky that was raining rock. They chose outside. They tied pillows onto their heads with cloth, and they went out. It was near dawn now, though there was no way to tell, because the darkness was total and had been for many hours. They went down towards the shore with torches to see whether the sea had calmed enough to launch anything. The sea had not calmed. It was wild and running the wrong way, and no boat was going anywhere. Pliny the Elder lay down on a sailcloth spread out on the ground. He asked for water twice and drank it. Then a smell of sulphur came through, and flames somewhere ahead of them, and the group around him got up to run. 2 of his slaves helped him to his feet. He stood up and he fell, and he did not get up again. His nephew, writing about it later, thought it was probably the thick air, that his uncle's windpipe had always been weak and had simply closed. It is more likely that it was gas, or heat, or the shock of it on a heavy man of 55 who had not been well. He was found 3 days afterwards when the light came back, lying where he had fallen, uninjured, still dressed, looking, his nephew wrote, more asleep than dead. He is the only Roman we know of who died, going towards a volcano, because he wanted to understand it. There are worse ways for a naturalist to finish. Back at the mountain, in the small hours, the eruption changed. It had been holding that 30-kilometer column up for something like 12 hours. It was doing this the way a fountain holds up water, by sheer force from below, and the whole structure only stays up as long as the force underneath stays constant. The force underneath began to falter. The vent had widened, the pressure had dropped, and the column could no longer be pushed to its full height. And so, instead of rising, the material at the top of it started to fall back down. Understand what that means. Hundreds of millions of tons of hot rock and gas that had gone straight up now came straight down onto the summit, and then, because it had nowhere else to go, it went outward, downhill, in every direction. This is a pyroclastic surge. A cloud of gas and ash and fragments, heavier than air, hugging the ground, moving at somewhere between 50 and 100 kilometers an hour, and carrying a temperature of several hundred degrees. You cannot outrun it. You cannot shelter from it in any building that exists. It goes around corners. It goes through doorways. It fills rooms. The first one came down the western side of the mountain in the middle of the night. On that side of the mountain, 4 or 5 kilometers from the summit, there was a smaller and considerably wealthier town called Herculaneum. Herculaneum had been lucky all evening. The wind had carried the ash the other way, and only a light dusting had reached it. It had spent the night watching the mountain in relative safety, while Pompeii disappeared under stone. Most of its people had used that time to leave. Some had gone inland. Others had gone down to the waterfront, where there was a row of stone boat chambers open to the sea, arched vaults where the fishing boats were kept. They gathered in those vaults, several hundred of them, waiting for the water to calm so that boats could take them off. They were still there when the first surge arrived. It came down the slope, crossed the town, and went out over the shore and into the sea. It was moving faster than anyone could react to it, and it was hot enough that death would have been immediate before there was time to feel it or to understand what was happening. Then 5 more surges followed through the rest of the night, each burying the town deeper, until Herculaneum lay under 20 meters of hot volcanic material that would cool and set almost as hard as concrete. Those vaults were opened in the 1980s. Until then, it had been assumed that Herculaneum's population had all escaped because so few bodies had been found. They found around 300 people, arranged along the arches in family groups, adults with their arms around children, one woman still wearing rings. We know an enormous amount about them, because that sealed heat preserved things nothing else preserves. Wooden beds and doors and shelves. A wooden cradle with a baby in it. Rope. Cloth. Fruit still on the stalk. A whole library of papyrus scrolls in one villa, carbonized into black cylinders that nobody could open for 2 centuries, and which are only now being read by scanning them and unrolling them inside a computer. That is Herculaneum. Not crushed. Sealed. The early surges did not reach Pompeii. The town was further away, on the wrong side, and the first few ran out of energy before they got there. So the people still in Pompeii spent the night under falling stone, in the dark, listening to roofs give way. And then, sometime before dawn, the pumice began to ease off. That must have felt like the end of it. The noise dropping, the fall thinning out. After 18 hours of it, the sudden relative quiet would have meant one thing to anyone still alive in that town, and that is that it was over and they could get out. People came up out of cellars and out from under staircases and started climbing over the pumice, which was now 2.5 meters deep and lying loose over everything, so that walking on it meant wading. Around 6:30 in the morning, the 4th surge came down the mountain, and this one had the energy to reach the town. It came in over the northern wall. Almost everyone still in Pompeii died in the next few minutes, from the heat and from breathing air that could not be breathed. Most of them were in the open, in the streets and the gardens and the fields just outside the gates, because they had come out believing the danger had passed. There is a garden in the south of the town where 13 of them were found together, adults and children, moving in the same direction. They are almost at the wall. There was a dog still on its chain in a hallway. 2 more surges came after that one, larger, and the last of them went out beyond the town and across the countryside for kilometers. By the time the mountain went quiet, in the early afternoon, Pompeii was under about 6 meters of material and had stopped existing as a place. Across the bay, the 17-year-old was still alive, and still, remarkably, taking notes. He and his mother had spent the night in their house, feeling the tremors get worse, and at first light, they decided to leave the buildings and get out into the open country. He wrote that the crowd pressed in behind them and pushed them along, and that carts on the flat road were rolling backwards and forwards on their own. Then the sea pulled away from the shore, leaving fish stranded on the sand, and a black cloud came across the water towards them with what looked like lightning inside it. Ash began to fall. Then darkness, the same total darkness. He wrote about the sound of it, which is the detail that stays with people. Women shrieking, children calling, men shouting, some looking for their families by voice and recognizing each other only by voice. Some praying for death because they were so afraid of dying. Many believing that there were no gods left anywhere and that this was the last night of the world forever. His mother told him to leave her behind because she was old and slow and he could get away if he was not carrying her. He refused, took her hand, and made her walk. They lived. The cloud that reached Misenum was the exhausted edge of something that had spent its force long before, and by the following afternoon the sun came back, weak and yellow, and everything they could see was under a layer of grey ash like snow. He was an unusually observant boy who grew into a careful and rather pleased with himself man, and he became a lawyer and a senator and a governor, and 25 years later the historian Tacitus wrote to him and asked what exactly had happened to his uncle. So he sat down and wrote 2 letters back. Those 2 letters are why we can tell this story at all. Everything else is rock and bone. The only voice that comes to us from the day itself belongs to a teenager who stayed home to finish an essay. When it stopped, the landscape had changed shape. The coastline had moved. The harbour that Pompeii's whole economy had been built around was now several hundred meters inland and buried. The river had been pushed out of its course. The mountain itself had lost its summit and gained a great broken crater where the top had been. Around 2,000 people are thought to have died in Pompeii, out of perhaps 12,000, and something similar or worse in the surrounding countryside. The true number is unknowable. The Emperor Titus, who had been in power for about 2 months, sent money and appointed officials to organize relief and to redistribute the property of families who had died without heirs. It was a competent, decent response, and there was nothing to respond to. There was nowhere to rebuild. Some survivors came back and dug down. You can see where they did it, tunnels driven through the debris towards where they knew a strong room or a good statue had been, with holes punched through walls from one house to the next. Some of that was owners recovering their own things. Some of it was people helping themselves. After a while, even that stopped. And then the ground healed over, as ground does. Vegetation came back into the ash, and because it was volcanic ash, it came back thickly. Vines were planted again on top of the town. Farms were established over the forum. The place became known locally as La Civita, the city, because there was a folk memory that something had been down there, but not what and not who. For 16 centuries, there were quiet fields sitting on top of a Roman town, and people ploughed them, and the mountains stood in the background looking green. In 1592, an architect named Domenico Fontana was cutting a water channel across that farmland for a local nobleman. His diggers went through walls. They went through painted plaster. At one point, they came out into a room with frescoes on it, some of them indecent by the standards of the day, and there was a certain amount of embarrassment, and an inscription mentioning a place called Pompeii was noted down and misread as a reference to somebody's estate. The channel was routed onward. The hole was filled in. Nobody followed it up for another 150 years. Herculaneum came first in 1738, when a Bourbon king put men down a well shaft to fetch out statues for his palace, which was less an excavation than an extremely deep act of shopping. 10 years later, they started digging at the other site, and in 1763, a stone was found carrying the words for the community of the Pompeians, and the town got its name back. The early digging was terrible. Frescoes were cut out of walls, and the rest whitewashed over. Objects were carted off without any record of which house they had come from. Skeletons were sometimes reburied, sometimes thrown away. But something began to change as the 19th century went on, and the person most responsible was an archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli, who took charge in 1863. Fiorelli did two things that mattered. The first was that he made them dig downwards from the top rather than tunneling in from the side, and record everything and leave what they found where it lay. That sounds obvious. It was not obvious then, and it is why Pompeii is a site rather than a quarry. The second is the thing everyone knows, even if they do not know his name. The diggers kept finding cavities in the hardened ash. Empty pockets of no obvious shape. It had been noticed for years and treated as an annoyance. Fiorelli worked out what they were. When the surges buried the bodies, the fine ash set hard around them very quickly, and then the body inside decayed away over the centuries and left a hollow in the exact shape of the person it had been. Not a fossil, a mold. So he had his men, whenever they hit one, stop and drill a small hole and pour liquid plaster in, and wait, and then chip the rock away from the outside. What came out were people, not skeletons. People at the size and the posture, and in some cases, the expression of the moment they stopped. Cloth folds, sandal straps, hair, a man lying on his front with his hands over his face, a woman on her side, a dog on a chain, on its back with its legs up, which is the hardest one to look at, and which is in every book about Pompeii for that reason. Modern casts are made in clear resin instead, so that the skeleton stays visible inside and can still be studied. Scans of them have told us about the diets these people ate and the illnesses they had, and in some cases, who was related to whom, which has quietly overturned a few old assumptions. A pair long described as sisters turned out to be unrelated, and one of them was a man. The digging still goes on. Roughly a third of the town has never been uncovered and is deliberately being left alone, because everything that is exposed begins to decay, and the best conservation for a Roman wall is another 4 meters of ash on top of it. Even so, new things keep coming up. A bakery with living quarters that had windows barred and no door to the street. A wall painting of a flatbread with fruit on it and a cup of wine beside it, which the newspapers all decided was the first pizza and which is not, but which is a nice picture of somebody's lunch. Rooms of dancing figures painted right around the walls. A garden and a shrine and a fresco of birds. Every one of these belonged to somebody who did not know they were leaving anything behind. That is where we will let it rest. Pompeii is not really a story about a volcano. Volcanoes are common and they are still going, and Vesuvius itself is still there. And there are about 600,000 people living in the red zone on its flanks today, because the soil is still the best in Italy, and because that is what people do. It is a story about an ordinary Tuesday. We have almost nothing from the ancient world that is ordinary. What survives is what somebody chose to keep. Temples, monuments, official inscriptions, the writings that were valuable enough to copy out again and again. We have the speeches and the epics and the emperors. We do not have the shopping lists. We do not have the rude joke somebody scratched next to a doorway, or the exact height of a curbstone, or a loaf of bread with the baker's stamp still on it, or the furniture, or the dog. From this one town, buried on one afternoon in autumn, we have all of it. Not because anyone valued it, but because nobody had the chance to tidy it away. That is the strange gift in the middle of the disaster. 2,000 people died, and because of it we can still walk down a street where the ruts are worn into the stone and know, with certainty, that a cart came this way, and another for years, driven by people who were thinking about something else. And out on a wall somewhere in that town, in a corridor, there is still that line that somebody scratched without thinking twice. Nothing lasts forever. The sun shines, and then it goes down into the sea. Sleep well,